regularly associated with Christian saintliness from the 4th century onward are lack of possessions, charity, humility, fortitude, and fervent prayer. And the historical record is clear that holy fools perform these characteristics of the Christian saint exquisitely. However, other characteristics of saintliness are trampled on by the holy fools. The narrative code that defines saintliness in Christendom also includes such qualities as quiet, solitude, self-control, discretion, peacemaking, segregation from the opposite sex and those considered sinners, modesty with regard to one's body, wisdom, obedience, and veneration for the church, for clergy, for sacraments. Defying these saintly codes, holy fools assume the characteristics of madness, violence, immorality, and demonic possession. For example, when taunted by children, Saint Xenia flew at them, waving her cane in the air. The residents of Storona were so startled at seeing the Blessed One in such anger that they took immediate steps to prevent any further offenses toward her. Such outbursts and threat of violence are not uncommon in the lives of holy fools. Of Saint Procope, we read that once the saint came to the spiritual father's house during dinner. While seated at the table, he took a knife and began waving it over the head of the confessor's son. Everyone became frightened. Another time, the same saint ran into the streets, tore off his shirt, and ran about getting himself dirty and blackened, wallowing in the litter, soot, ashes, and filth of the bathhouse stoves, prohibited roadhouses, drinking house kitchens, and markets. Such transgressive behavior is the norm for holy fools. An incident from the 6th century reveals multiple egregious violations of the saintly narrative. There was once a village leader who found Saint Simeon by chance while one prostitute was carrying him and another was whipping him. Immediately the headman was scandalized, and he reasoned with himself, does Satan himself not believe this false abbot is fornicating with them? At once the fool left the women, came toward the village leader, and hit him. Then, stripping off his tunic, he danced naked and whistled. In addition to the holy fool's antics and immorality, he also employs the representations of sacrilege and profanation, which is for many a behavior most antithetical to the Christian code of sanctity. In violation of the most holy, somber, mournful period of the liturgical calendar, the time in which Christ's crucifixion is observed, and is a time of strict fasting, we read of St. Simeon that from early on in the morning of Holy Thursday, he sat in the cake shop and gorged himself, so that those who saw him were scandalized. And in a crowning act of blasphemy, we read that the same holy fool, when Sunday came, he took a string of sausages and wore them about his neck as a deacon's stole. In his hand he held a pot of mustard, and he dipped the sausages in the mustard and ate them from morning on. And he smeared mustard on the mouths of those who came to joke with him. He took nuts, and entering the church at the beginning of the liturgy, threw the nuts and put out the candles. When they hurried to run after him, he went up to the pulpit, and from there pelted the women with nuts. With great trouble they chased after him, and while he was going out, he overturned the table of the pastry chefs, who nearly beat him to death. So, referring to cultural performance, Alexander observes that even the best acting cannot ensure that the audience gets it right. But in the case of the Holy Fool's performance, what could getting it right possibly mean? Until now, cultural pragmatics has had only the monosemous concept of performance with which to work, reducing nearly all questions of interpretation to matters of actor authenticity. Accordingly, a performance is successful to the degree the audience deems it natural and unfeigned. However, if this were all there were to becoming cultural performances, how would someone who felt the Holy Fool was authentic interpret his behavior? Is he an authentic saint? Or is he an authentic lunatic? Audience interpret ambiguous performances based on their own identity. This is the opposite of cultural pragmatics definition of performance, where we are all viewed as actors who are forever performing in an effort to display for others the meaning of our social situation. In the case of St. Terence, we read that many people understood and profited greatly from his spiritual lessons, while others hated him for his foolish ways. Likewise with Saint Bessarion, who taught everyone in the manner of a fool, with actions and words that were comprehensible only to those for whom they were intended. So instead of seeing performances as monolithic, consisting exclusively of the monosemous type, we can now see that monosemous and ambiguous performances occupy opposite poles of a performance continuum. The closer a performance is to the monosemous pole, the more it communicates the performer's social position. The closer it is to the ambiguous pole, the more it communicates the audience's social position. In the former, the audience reads the text of the performance, but in the latter, the text of the performance reads the audience. That is to say, an ambiguous performance compels the audience to reveal their own social role by forcing them to choose between the performance's incompatible interpretations. In doing this, audiences rely on their own identities to make the choice, projecting elements of their own persona into the performer.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Professor Giesen.
Thank you very much for this excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you. Did you hear that?
But there are others.
Okay.
The first is that you fail in a way to account for the distinction between a theatrical performance, where no real thing is constructed. I mean, if you are engaging in a wedding, in a Shakespearean wedding, it has no binding force afterwards, after the play is closed. And on the other hand, the ritual performance, which is basically driven by the idea, by the suspicion that they are unauthentic. So the groom and the bride are saying, yes, I do. And the suspicion, the interesting suspicion is they are lying. So the hermeneutics of illusion in theater have to be distinguished from the hermeneutics of suspicion. And we are basically under the ban of this hermeneutics of suspicion, because we don't want other people to be authentic. We want to know what they are heading for, and so on. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I will focus on one particular feature of this sacred food. And my uncorroborated hunch is that the first and most important sacred food was St. Francis. You know that from Turner. And that all the other things, that he basically established a narrative that was repeated again and again and again in the centuries to follow. And everybody wanted to become as successful as the saint as St. Francis was. And why was St. Francis so keen about nudity? The answer is because it was a reenactment of the paradise. Paradise was the first stage of nudity, and afterwards, when they left paradise, they recognized and they noticed they were naked. And then they put on society, dresses, robes, and so on. And my idea is that basically St. Francis established this narrative, and the later on follow-up saints or sacred fools wanted to surpass it. And that goes along up to the Joseph Boyce, who is also a sacred fool, was a sacred fool. And he somehow filled out in a non-religious way the position of St. Francis. And I have to stop.
Yeah, so, I mean, historically, the holy fools would actually go back to like the 4th century, like 800 years before St. Francis. St. Francis is definitely in the West, the sort of paragon of that. But in the East, there's a very different tradition, and I think it looks quite different. St. Francis had elements of childlikeness, But most people did not interpret him as insane, right? So they may have disagreed with him, but he had audience with the Pope, like he had an order. These people are not in that category. These people are actually enacting the performance of insanity, which I would want to distinguish in the case of St. Francis as being actually quite different. But we can discuss.
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
And what about theater and the illusion?
The illusion, so the way I understand this is this behavior is not part of a ritual, for example. This is daily life with daily cultural codes. And I want to draw a distinction between ritual behavior and non-ritual behavior, which I would consider this a part of. These are just as the people who, one of the first three quotes that I read, one of those people was just considered insane. He wasn't considered insane, right? Even though the behavior was quite similar. So I guess I would want to say that's not what
framing it, medicalizing everything, and therefore.
But absolutely. But that's what they did, right? So I'm just trying to make this at this point very descriptive. This is what happened, and I'm not even trying to plumb the depths of the intentions or anything like that of the actors. And that doesn't totally address your questions, but okay.
Oh, great. It's gonna have my booming voice in it. Oh, please don't record me. I'm quite alright. So, I have a couple things I'd like to challenge you on here, and I think these, coming from me, shouldn't be terribly new to you. The first, this is so awkward, right? The first is something you mentioned early on regarding cultural pragmatics, where it sounded to me as though your description of performing fatherhood sounded very intentional, and I would contend that it's not. That you don't think to yourself, what would a father, or no, you may think, what would a father do, but you don't think, oh, I need to perform the father because there's any function in that. Instead, I think rather that you understand yourself in a narrative as a father, and so the consequential actions seem fairly given to you. So that's the first part. The second part is the idea of why the monosemous versus ambiguous needs to be a continuum. Because I can't quite understand what the difference stages between it would be, or what that might appear as. There was either it was clear, or you read into it. From there, I would then say, because you have to rely on background narrative in the first place, or background structures in the first place to make a performance, is it necessarily that you do the performance and you successfully perform the role, or does it still require on an audience interpretation regardless? Because it's always going to depend on what background structures are available for the audience. You may perform the role of American Dad flawlessly, but if I have no idea that you regulating clothing is a normal part of fatherhood, I might think you were some kind of despotic house ruler. The last part that I'll go at for now is, why is Holy Fool not a unique role in and of itself? Why is it, it seems to be we're not sure which it is, when to me it seems rather that you've managed to successfully identify something where you say, anybody who was named a saint, but didn't do all the saintly things we usually associate with sainthood, becomes this very clear role. And clearly we're reading these performances as that, and identifying it as such. So why is that an ambiguous performance, when rather you very clearly said, this is what this is?
Sure.
And as the last part, who named these people as saints? Because there was nothing, it would seem to me that the reason it was confusing is because you told me it was a saint, and you said, but they didn't do anything saintly. Well, yes, according to the collective representation, that doesn't make any sense. They're defiling sainthood. But I wouldn't personally have been confused about their performance. They didn't perform sainthood. There are criteria for sainthood, but I think everybody performs them to some degree. It's the extent of that performance that performs the saint.
Okay.
Sorry, that was a lot.
I think I counted 5 questions.
Yeah.
I will hopefully get to most of them. With regard to the performance of fatherhood, yeah, definitely part of cultural pragmatics, like Jeff explicitly says, consciously or unconsciously, right? So the performance doesn't have to be intentional. I would agree with you. These things, reading my daughter bedtime stories, etc., I may do unreflexively just because it just seems like the right thing to do because of my culture, right? In fact, I think it's really important for me in this work to completely bracket intention. Because with the Holy Fools in particular, the moment I try to attribute attention, I decide whether it's a duck or a rabbit, right? If they are performing intentionally, that tends to me to indicate that they're not really insane, right? So I literally, like I said to Professor Giesen, I'm not even looking at intentionality, but I would totally agree with what you said. I didn't mean to imply otherwise, that many performances, if not most, are not intentional. Although, when you read Goffman, that almost seems to be the, often there's this intentionality emphasized that I actually totally disagree with. So I'm with you there. Why is this not a unique role? Why is this an ambiguous performance? I believe maybe, this was not in my presentation, but it's something I'm thinking about, that this may be one way that new social roles emerge, right? The combining of two incompatible roles, such that while there was no such thing in the year 300 of our era of a holy fool, now there is, right? Maybe. We could talk about other instances such as gender performance, androgyny. Will androgyny eventually become a new gender category? It would be categorized as an ambiguous performance today. Same also with artificial intelligence. Right now, that's not really a big issue, but in 100 years, 200 years, if there are things that really appear, that we've made, that really appear to be alive and intelligent, we will have the same issue. We have life and non-life, intelligence and non-intelligence. We have these two categories. They seem to be incompatible. When we put them together, then we're going to run into the same situation. So perhaps eventually a third category does emerge. So I would say perhaps yes now, but certainly not then.
Thank you very much. I have a long list of names, so please think accordingly. I just tell you who's on it, so maybe you are not on it yet. Werner, Ross, Jan, Anna, Gita, Astrid. Your name is Paul. Okay.
That was perfect. Because
Myself, Robert and Ekaterina.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this fantastic presentation, because it hints also at some criticisms that I have with the performance concept of Jeffrey Alexander and the paradigm of performance, I think at least. And as far as I understood you, this very special case of the fool has implications for the general paradigm of performance. And what you suggest is to strengthen the autonomy of the audience in the meaning-making process. And I think the fool is a perfect example, because there are no shared meaning structures anymore between the performer and the audience. And in a strange way, it's the most authentic performance that one can imagine, even though there are no shared meaning structures at all. Precisely because there are no. And I would like to ask, how far would you go with this criticism? Because certain concepts Jeff uses in his performance, Jeff Alexander uses in his performance theory, like projection, extension, fusion, which thinks performance as something that goes out from the performer, more or less intentionally, though often unconsciously, tries to project the meaning the performer has in his mind on the audience. And isn't it better, for example, to use a neutral concept like resonance? Performances are just a kind of dramatic symbols that pop up and have different effects in different audiences. And what is important is not so much the success of the performance, but the kind of relation between certain and often different background structures in different audiences and the performance as a kind of symbol.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you know, it's in some ways my critique, right? Like this idea of projecting this image all the time, which again, it's not. I don't think it's unique to Jeff. I think most dramaturgical explanations of social behavior have the same issue, and so. Yeah.
10 years ago, in this very city, we had a joint seminar, Jefferson and the performance, and he invented the idea of split performances and layered performances. The layered audiences and split audiences. Which was the version exactly to this.
But he doesn't talk about it anymore.
I believe that, I mean, that you can have lots of different audiences, and I can perform, you know, the role of father perfectly, and then when the bill collector for my daughter's student debts knocks on my door, I may deny being a father altogether. Right? That's not an ambiguous performance. That's I'm talking about simultaneous, consistent one role that's ambiguous. So there's ambiguity in the world, there are lots of different audiences, lots of different structures. I'm talking about a very unique, sort of technical definition of an ambiguous performance, which I've already listed, you know, holy fool, androgyny, artificial intelligence. I believe those three would exemplify what I'm getting at.
Yeah, thank you, Ross.
Shall I direct my question to the camera?
Please state your name and address.
Todd, it was a great talk. Yeah, and it hurts, you know, you being a Yale man to say that, but it's really interesting. You mentioned that the origin of this would predate St. Francis. I wonder if you gave Diogenes any thought and how Diogenes might relate to the Holy Fool. And I guess along those lines, regarding the homelessness of the Holy Fools, homeless, yes, but in this city, probably,
Yes.
I imagine.
Yes.
And also related to Andrew's question, their saintness this is a saintness that is attributed by popular acclamation. They're not beatified, they haven't performed miracles.
Right. I won't
Okay.
address that.
Okay, that's fine. And yeah, Diogenes, I guess, it comes to mind, and perhaps specifically with the divide that was suggested between theatricality and reality, and where it seems to me that perhaps one of the things that the Holy Fool is doing is putting those things into question, the same way I thought that Diogenes was putting into question, right? That in fact our social gain is just that, and what is the ambiguity finally is also a mirror of our lives, if you will.
Sure. Okay. So the short answer, in terms of who said that these are saints, right? So yeah, in the East, the process of canonization is different than in the Catholic Church. It is a little bit more of a grassroots kind of movement up. So there was, in each of these cases, enough of the population to say, yes, this was a saint. Often they will have things like their bones will be uncorrupted, right? There are other sort of things like that. But all of the people that I read from are officially recognized by the East Orthodox Church as official saints. Again, you can go, there are icons, there are some special hymns that are sung to them on their saints' days, so they are official, even though it's a little different in the East than the West. In terms of Diogenes, so if we assume that these individuals were posing, right, then I think we've already made a decision about what they're doing, right? So I guess I'm trying to bracket, again, I mentioned this couple, I'm trying to bracket that intentionality so that in the case of Diogenes, it was pretty clear that that's what he was doing, right? I mean, he was performing, he had a philosophical point to make, and he made it, he embodied it. But that's different than in these cases, right? These cases, we don't know. Diabetes is strange, but I kind of get it, right? These guys, I don't know what to make. Duck or rabbit, I don't know. And again, depending on whatever, I can't describe it any other way than my own interpretive constitution, for a vague term, right? I somehow come to a decision on that. But because it is this confluence of incompatible roles, there's nothing in the culture to guide me as to which side to come down on. So that, and maybe to get back to the continuum thing, I think maybe that happens to lesser and greater degrees. I don't know. I mean, I'm willing to talk more about that and debate that. I thought it's safer to say a continuum than there are either ambiguous or monosemous roles, but I give
You covered.
Thank you. Jan, and then after that, I will repeat this roughly a couple of times.
Yeah. First of all, let me also congratulate you on the first successful presentation. In defense of Kaufman, I think you could actually be read, and I totally reading that way, that it is in no way about intention or intentionality. It is rather about the definition of situations, roles, and scripts which come before any kind of performance, but which inform any kind of performance. And the intentionality that Kaufman mentioned is rather something like the intentionality all people have trying to understand the situation, because it is not clear in Kaufman's case. And I think this concept would help you, because it would make, you could make the point that there is a fixed role, not ambiguous, just the other way around, a very fixed and clear, precise role regarding holy tools. And if people debate that, I mean, the arguments could be considered as such a case, but there is a general, someone could also have mythic kind of archetype, you know, the trickster, the prankster, the one that goes against all rules, that breaks everything apart. And every culture, every religion has always sanctified those rule breakers. Not the one that is this one-time defiant, but the one that is constantly defiant, defies all rules and is therefore to be considered in some way spirited by other worldly forces, nothing like that. In this case, I think there is a rather interesting notion, which also Elias mentioned in his theory of the process of civilization, that actually these kinds of roles or the definitions for those situations become fewer as the imperative of controlling our own affects and becoming more or less, because we have broadened the horizon of what is defiant and what certain parts of defiance can be constructed. And today we do not longer saint these people or see in them some mystical connection, but we rather put them away and say, well, they're sick, they shouldn't have anything to do with us. We do it also in the smaller parts. So I think there can be a case to be made that we should also look maybe at the historical dimension of this. And Foucault also mentioned this in his work on insanity, that exactly there came this time of breaking where the once idolized figures now become the mentally insane.
I guess I would, maybe I won't say it. No, I really do think, though, that while Foucault maps this historic change, what we're seeing in the case of Holy Fools, we're seeing a culture in the present, in each of these situations, that has a code of insanity. They understand in their own way what someone who's crazy is, and they understand what someone who is a saint is, and they can't figure it out. Like he's enacting both of these codes at the same time. And I didn't read in my presentation, actually went faster than I thought I was going to go, but one of the things I would have done is give you more examples. I stated that they performed perfectly some of the characteristics of saintliness. I would have given more examples of those. And in fact, when you read the lives of these holy fools, most of it is not the crazy stuff. Most of it is the long, vigils of prayer, these sorts of things. So there truly was this combination of these roles that make it so difficult. And also, there are other people who acted insane, according to those codes, who never said anything. Right? In fact, probably the majority. Yes, sir.
Right. I have 9 names on the list, and I'm closing the list, and I'm copying people who are unidentified.
Okay, my question was a bit interaction what has already been mentioned. I was going to try to formulate it because also talking Diogenes immediately, and I think the notion that we all know that Diogenes is posing seems to me to be rather on to us.
Sure.
The story of the Holy Fools has been passed on with an element of mystery, and I think that's also what Jan was trying to indicate, and the element of mystery is necessary for the holiness. Diogenes didn't need to be holy because he wasn't integrated in that kind of religious interpretation. So that would be just the first comment to finish up and maybe wrap up that point there. But what I would be interested in, very interesting presentation again, very nice ideas, great theoretical background there. You told us in the beginning that 3 examples, and 2 of them are considered saints, 1 is not. My question now would be, can you, with the tools you presented to us, explain how come that 2 of them were considered saints and 1 wasn't? What is it that your now theoretical background is providing you in order to be able to gauge when exactly audiences can project their interpretation towards mad or towards holy? That's what I haven't understood yet.
Yeah, no, I don't know that I can answer that question. I mean, that's what each one of these little societies, these cultures, usually a city, would be confronted with this very question. And they, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Many of the things that I was thinking about were already mentioned, but I'm thinking when Alexander works with his social performance framework, there's 3 moments of fusion. There's protection, which comes from psychoanalysis, and that's the fusion with the cultural background, the goals. Then there's projection when I manage to, no, it's the other way around. The projection is when I fuse with the cultural background. The protection is when I transgress the theatric, I reach the theatricality, I become the person. It's not only a performance of a theater, but I really am this person that I'm performing. And then there's identification. And I believe that, or I'm reading your presentation rather as speaking about or complexifying the idea of identification. And not only identification in the sense of I identify myself with you, but also I identify you as someone. And what I found the most interesting in your presentation was when you started speaking about the third category, because I think, I'm not sure if this is questioning Alexander's framework, but I think that it's pointing towards the problematics of...
Cultural practice might be canonized in your period.
Maybe. They might, but I will try to keep my line of thought. But the important aspect is the dynamics. And I'm thinking about how each subversive or ambiguous performance creates completely different reactions. You were speaking about elimination, you were speaking about beatings, you were speaking about playing along, and I was thinking about laughter, and I was thinking about so many different reactions that can be triggered by something something that's uncanny. And I wonder how something that's uncanny actually becomes a category, because we have the sins, we have the holy fools, we have just fools, we have, I don't know, the third gender is already a category in some countries.
Right.
So I think it's interesting, but I'm just putting my input into the discussion.
I think there's something really important. Yeah, just briefly on your comments. There's something I think, and I haven't been able to figure it out, but there is something really important about essential characteristics and identity, core identity, that makes the ambiguous performance work. Whereas if there were things that were not considered essential, it would not happen, right? So it really is about, like I mentioned, right, life or non-life, gender, insanity. These are like really important essential characteristics. And people, for whatever reason, feel compelled to put you into one of those categories, one of those categories. So I'm glad that you said that, and I wrestled with that. Half addressed it a little bit.
Okay, next to Astrid and Ron.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This is a revenge.
Yeah.
now. Okay. Well, my comment is actually relating very much to what has been said in the room already. I very much like your remark on identification, and I really like in your presentation that you said you wanted to bracket intention and intentionality. My idea on that was similar to what Andrew has said, that I actually didn't get what is so ambiguous about this performance. I mean, content-wise, what like, is it ambiguous because you don't know whether it's a saint or a crazy person, or what was the point? Okay, yeah, because then I would say you could also work with actor network theory that says that everything does something somehow, and it's not about what is meant by it, but what is the result of it.
How can you? Oh, sorry. So you.
Yeah, that was.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks a lot for your talk. It was talk about the first time. I think it's a great thing you have on tape now. So we don't know whether it's the first time.
Yeah, I say that in every presentation. Yeah.
So I have one comment and one question. Sure. So the common consistent thanks to more examples for your term ambiguous performance. And the first has already been mentioned, it is the trickster. So the social figure that is intentionally producing conflict of meaning of interpretation in the audience. The second one would be the anti-hero. He's neither good nor bad. Is the audience cannot really decide, shall it be sympathetic with him, or is he just a failure? And the third one could be the stranger. So he is near and distant at the same time. He is inside and outside at the same time. So your term, ambiguous performance, could lead at a different logic than either or, and point at an object perhaps as well as. It is both. And that would be, for example, my question would be, when we look at this classic term of performance in Austin, then what Austin gives us is this very clear felicity conditions. So, and my question would be, what Austin does in the old terms is he points at the felicity conditions of monosemus performances. Right. But when in your terms would an ambiguous performance fail?
Okay. So, well, first of all, with regard to the as well as, what I want to say is, again, the roles are contradictory. So I can be a professor as well as an angry drone, right? Like these two are not necessarily incompatible. But can I be an insane person and a saint? Well, 1,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, no. Now maybe, right? So there's a sense in which those roles, in order to avoid the as well as, have to be incompatible in order for it to qualify for what I'm calling an ambiguous performance. Actor network theory. I don't know. That theory actually kind of confuses me a little bit. I mean, we are projecting things. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have enough traction with that to really comment on that part of what you said.
Well, it doesn't matter.
Okay. Next pair is myself and Robert. I want to pick up on what you just said about the contradiction between insanity and sainthood. I'm not so sure. First of all, in Scripture there is a passage by St. Paul in the first letter of Corinthians where he explicitly uses the fool as like the Christian is a fool. So therefore there is some kind of basis there. And of course in the wider frame of Axel H, what the fool, or the holy fool rather, that's the important distinction, what the holy fool does is by breaking the boundary between the divine sphere and the profane sphere, it exactly lets that sphere come through. And so, and it's interesting that the sainthood is something that happens ex post. It's something that happens in hindsight. It, in a way, works like trauma. You know, it takes a while to kind of let it sink in, and then you say, oh wow, yeah, this is actually, this was an amazing character, and yeah, the disturbance that he created in our lives was actually safe rather than insanity. So I wonder whether that kind of the uncanny, the trauma, Edith has already mentioned that plays a role, and the role of the axial kind of dichotomy between the here and now and the transcendent. And Robert?
Yeah, thank you. I also like to talk, and I wanted to get back to your point where I was saying the ambiguous performances as social mechanisms for invention of new roles. You mentioned the transgender AI. That I like to, I'm just not really sure, because I think if you take authors like, right of the postmodern tradition, like Stephen Bauman, they would probably say, there's not just these roles, it's basically everybody is now forced into ambiguous roles. So I guess precisely sort of the difference to pre-modern societies, right? That we are not having unambiguous roles. Just the father, even the example with the father, you could say, we're supposed to be the best friend, but we're also supposed to let go. We're also supposed to be very disciplined. So it's very ambiguous and unclear. So I couldn't imagine that some of these authors in this theory tradition would say, the ambiguous behavior, or like this kind of attitude is basically what is supposed to come. I mean, you can even push it further, like people like Konstanzer Meisterklasse, they would say that's exactly precisely the neoliberal logic, right? Being continuously forced into ambiguity. And the only thing that we cannot do is having a very unambiguous, stable persona. We're always forced into inventing ourselves, always to change continuously. So this is like basically the neoliberal logic, right? I mean, I'm just saying, I'm not standing at that point. I'm just saying that some authors would make the point that that's actually already happening. It's not just some invention, something like pioneers, entrepreneurs who do that, but it's actually a condition of all of the us, right? And it's basically even already implemented in the logic of, if you will, capitalist system.
Right. So, to go backwards again. Yes, I mean, in one sense, everything is ambiguous. Everything can be read in multiple ways. Like Roland Barthes taught us this, right? As have many others have pointed this out. I would argue that that culture is not so disintegrated in terms of the postmodern, this sort of theory of postmodernism where everything is kind of negotiable, and we still identify people as male and female, right? We still make these categorizations. Maybe someday that won't exist, but I would argue very strongly that today is absolutely happening, and certainly in the case of the Holy Fools, that was happening for most people, which is all I'm saying. Some people may not, but I believe that while there may be subtleties, like in fatherhood, the way I operate as a father, other people may operate differently, perform differently, but there is a general cultural understanding of what that looks like. In terms of other, I don't know if Torn or if it was Robert or Torn, but in terms of the other examples, politics could be another one, where, for example, a politician projects an ambiguous message so that his or her audience reads into it what they want to, right? And that politician is able to maintain, as opposed to a politician who tells one group, oh yes, I'm going to raise taxes because you like that, or this group, I'm not going to raise taxes because you, and then he gets called out and he's a hypocrite. It's not an ambiguous performance, he's just being a hypocrite, right? He's not performing those two things simultaneously. But an ambiguous performance in politics, and this maybe Andy gets back to maybe why a continuum would be helpful. We looked at Obama's first campaign. I mean, there was a lot of hope, change. These are very ambiguous terms. He was able to accuse his McCain of flip-flopping, right? Telling one person one thing and another. But for Obama, he had this ambiguous idea that people read into. And people felt disillusioned after that because once he started performing his role, they were like, oh, I thought it was going to be this. Oh, I thought it was going to be this, right?
Very good.
To get to your point about St. Paul uses the expression, talks about the foolishness of Christ, right? That's certainly where we got the expression holy fool. It came from that letter. So it's scriptural for sure, but the argument that I would make is St. Paul never made this sort of argument. I believe, and as have the expositors of that passage throughout the ages have said, no, that's not what he's talking about. We're not supposed to be crazy, right?
St. John the Baptist.
Christians should be a stranger in this world. That also means famous.
Right. And so how is that interpreted? Probably not by defecating in the square. You know what I mean? Like, there are certain ways of interpreting that. I'm very, I like that. I like that notion. But I don't think and I tried to give some extreme examples of this behavior, and I don't think St. Paul would have any sympathy toward that sort of thinking. That's my guess.
Can I intervene here, because you're falling into the trap of identification and intentionality again in your examples, which you said you didn't want to have intentionality in. So I would like to point.
How so?
Yeah, because you were talking about the words you are using. He's a hypocrite. You can be only a hypocrite if you pretend something. If that is intentional. I mean, there is an intention
According
there.
To the audience, yes. So the audience is judging the intention, which they are in this case.
Yes, and that's exactly what I mean by actor network theory. Think from the outcome, what is coming out of this, and not from what's put into it, maybe. And then maybe find a vocabulary that makes it a little bit clearer on where are you standing in your description. Then you have a better and a more neat distinction. And then again the question, but maybe for us in the question.
Cut this, and I don't want you to answer at this moment. I want to finish this list, and then we'll have a discussion with whether you want to continue. And those people who want to continue, and everybody else can leave. So next one is Ekaterina and Johanna.
Well, yeah, my question is also touching on the main points that have already been discussed, and I'm going to narrow it down to 2 points. First, you're talking about simultaneity, and I would ask if you maybe elaborate a little, or in some way to make it a little bit more clear what you mean by simultaneity, also following the Martin's question, because, well, when I'm trying to think about this, your example, I'm not thinking so much in the performance theory concept, but in what I was presenting before, so trying to locate this as a transgression taken into frame and so on. And then we can see that this kind of figure requires a lot of meaning-making work, and it takes time to interpret that and to fix those meanings. And in that sense, what it means to perform simultaneously contradictory role.
Yes.
And the other question also follows from that, and that is how are you drawing the line between, or why are you are trying to develop methodological point, introducing you to the theory, to the conceptual instrument, but not stop this whole situation can also be discussed as an empirical case of the meaning making, and you can rather talk why, for example, in the Middle Ages there was this holy fool figure, and I don't know, later there was a figure of, at some point a figure of this artificial intelligence has become this very strong, comprising 2 contradictory roles, and or this androgyny idea. These are very strong, I mean, this all implies very strong categories, because in saint and fool, it's like opposite ends of the continuum, which is addressing really core ideas, as well as androgyny, which also deals with categories which are very basic, and it's not so easy to get rid of them or to reinterpret them. So yeah, and so this difference between working with the theory and working with the interpretation of the case. So which argument are you actually making? And in that sense, if you are making a theoretical argument, then what does it, coming back to the honest question, what does it add to the theory?
Okay.
fantastic presentation. I don't believe it was your first presentation. My question is about the reflection about possibility of thinking on holy food through literature, through a particular phenomenon in identity and literature, which is mimesis and antiquotism and exotism. Well, the interesting idea the author talked about the ambiguous performance that have the capacity to articulate like social roles that makes people just to review all the social roles in order to identify what is that is happening in that performance. And literature has also that kind of capacity of mirroring identification, so it allows you through fiction and that particular means which is identification, but at the same time it's an ambiguous identification with the representation. It makes you review and rethink about social roles through that experience, the experience of mimesis. And there is that specific kind of figure, which is the critic soldier, and it's also Marie, so there are many ways of entering that, but I like Don Quixote because of the similarity also with the Holy Fool. It's somebody who is acting socially in a very strange way. You don't know if he is fool or not. He can do anything, but I mean, kind of anything, and at the end, you cannot say if he's fainting or not. But in the origin of Quixotism, there is his failure to perform reality, and he's performing literature reality. So the idea of performing literature as a way of role performance, and also we can think of Hamlet, another made that moment, Erasmus also, there is something going on with literature, taking that place of reflection on social identity, and I just don't know.
I would like to bring in the last two statements and then we can round up. And then we can officially close but stay behind and continue as people would like to do so. So next one is Philip and start.
Yeah, and I probably would like to add to the comments of that you like as basically two very interesting stories which probably don't really fit so well to each other. The one story is like the story about the crisis of identification, which is unable somehow to re-identify and come to terms with something. And the other story is a story about the holy fools. And the problem is you can see, and I think we can identify the holy fools because we say this is a holy fool, this is just a fool, this is a cynic, and they're like all somehow very similar, but in each case we can identify them, and sometimes maybe we need time to identify them. For example, with a cynic, now we are saying this is a cynic. Madman, now we are saying this is a madman. Schizophrenic, now we are saying this is a, but we develop like these categories so they're there. And this brings me like just to the point you made at the beginning. I think that's a really interesting story which probably like much better. If you also mentioned it's a trickster and like the person like who somehow like acts in a way that you think you identify, but at the same time the identification is very identification. It raises the suspicion that what you see is not there. And then you have like really like an example for like an ambiguous, like ambiguous phenomenon which you really can identify because like on the one hand you think like it's a perfect performance of like what you think you see, and at the same time there's like a big suspicion that you can't like really deal with like which somehow goes against your own interpretation.
Thank you. And finally, Sally.
Yes, I wish to take a step backward and say that when we address historical sources, we should ask ourselves three questions. First, who is the writer, and for which reason he or she write the text, or the source, the historical sources you address, and in which context was it written. It's obvious that, at least for me, that we cannot accept the authority of the text as describing social reality. And my question to you is, how do you treat the problem of contextuality in your analysis?
Before you respond in whatever way you choose, I'd like to finish from my point of view the two part because that allows the continued continuous flow out of his response. We reconvene tomorrow, mastered by Professor Karin Knoll at 10 o'clock. And thank you so much for a wonderful day with lots and lots of discussion and participation. It's yours.